At my brother's promotion ceremony, I was publicly shamed for not being on the guest list. He smirked as our parents walked right past me, leaving me to stand there completely invisible. The humiliation felt like a knife twisting in a wound I'd carried for years. But what they didn't know was that the real guest of honor wasn't my brother. It was me, and the reckoning was about to begin. Before we get into it, let me know what part of the world you're listening from in the comments, and make sure you subscribe for more stories like this. The phone call came on a Tuesday, cutting through the quiet hum of my university office. It was my mother, her voice a familiar blend of strained cheerfulness and subtle obligation. "Althea, darling," she began without a real hello. "I hope we're still going to see you this weekend. You haven't forgotten about Damon's big day, have you?" I leaned back in my chair, the worn leather groaning in protest. The view from my window overlooked a quiet, leafy campus quad, a world away from the rigid brass and polish universe my family inhabited. "No, Mom, I haven't forgotten," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Wonderful," she chirped. "He's being promoted to full colonel. Your father is just bursting with pride. We all are. It's so important for the family to be there to show a united front." I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air. A united front, as long as I played my part correctly. The quiet, slightly odd older sister, with the respectable but ultimately useless profession. For them, my doctorate in cultural anthropology was a quaint novelty, something to be explained away at dinner parties. They didn't understand my fieldwork in remote, often hostile corners of the world. In their minds, I studied forgotten tribes, while my brother, Colonel Damon Grant, made real tangible history. "I'm sure it will be a lovely ceremony," I replied, keeping my tone light. "Oh, it will be," she continued, her voice tightening slightly. "Just darling, try to wear something appropriate, not one of your fieldwork outfits. You know how your father feels about appearances." The implication was clear. Don't be yourself. Don't be the woman who spent 6 months documenting kinship structures in the Hindu Kush. Be the sister of a decorated officer. Blend in, stay small. It was the same silent script I'd been handed my entire life. "I'll do my best." "Mom," I said, the words feeling like ash in my mouth. The call ended soon after, leaving a familiar hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't just that they didn't understand my work. It was that they had never truly tried. They saw my life's passion as a hobby, a distraction from the main event, which was and always had been Damon's glorious military ascent. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, a picture of me with a village elder in Afghanistan, his weathered face crinkled in a genuine smile. We had just successfully negotiated a water rights agreement between two warring clans, an act that prevented bloodshed and saved lives. It was a victory no one in my family would ever see a medal I would never wear on a uniform. To them, I was just Althea, the academic, the one who didn't quite fit. And this weekend, I was expected to drive down to Fort Benning and applaud the brother who saw me as little more than a footnote in his own story. The memory surfaced without warning, a ghost slipping through the cracks of the present. I closed my eyes, the scent of old books in my office, fading away, replaced by the smell of dust, wood smoke, and something metallic, like fear. I was back in the Korengal Valley, a place so dangerous and remote, it was known to soldiers as the Valley of Death. It wasn't a library or a university grant that had sent me there. It was a clandestine directive from the Department of Defense. My official cover was a research project for the Smithsonian studying the linguistic drift of isolated Pashtun subtribes. It was a plausible lie, just academic enough to be dismissed by anyone who wasn't looking closely. My family certainly never did. They heard Smithsonian and imagined me in a temperature-controlled archive, not in a mud brick hut negotiating with a warlord whose name was on a kill list. The flashback was sharp, visceral. I was sitting cross-legged on a threadbare rug sharing tea with a man named Gulab. To the American forces, he was an insurgent leader. To me, after months of careful relationship building, he was a grandfather worried about an encroaching rival clan. He trusted me not because I was an American, but because I had taken the time to understand the intricate web of honor debt and blood feuds that had governed his valley for centuries. I knew his grandson's name. I had listened to his stories. That day, the tension was a physical presence in the room. A rival faction funded by outside money had moved into the valley's northern ridge. Gulab's men were outnumbered and outgunned. He knew it. I knew it. A U.S. Army patrol, my brother Damon's unit, was unknowingly heading into the very same area, a perfect kill box. They were walking into a massacre. There was no time for official channels. The patrol's radio frequencies were being jammed, a sophisticated tactic the rival faction had just acquired. They were blind. I looked at Gulab, my heart pounding against my ribs. Using the complex dialect he and I had developed a rapport, in a language of respect and shared history, I spoke not of military strategy, but of family. I explained that the rival clan's victory would dishonor the memory of his ancestors and disrupt the sacred balance of the valley. He listened, his dark eyes fixed on mine. He didn't see an academic. He saw someone who understood his world. He then unrolled an old piece of goatskin and, using a piece of charcoal, drew a map. It wasn't a map of roads or elevations. It was a map of a legions of ancient footpaths known only to his people, of safe passages that bypassed the ambush points. It was a map of survival. He handed it to me and said, "Go. Keep the ghosts of war from my valley today." The memory dissolved, leaving me back in the sterile quiet of my office. The ache in my chest had returned sharper this time. That scrap of goatskin had saved over 100 American lives, my brothers included. But the report I filed was classified, buried under layers of operational security. The official story was that Damon's unit had escaped due to his brilliant and intuitive command. He never knew the truth. He never asked. And as I prepared to drive to his ceremony, I was once again just his sister, the one who studied useless things. Fort Benning, Georgia, rose from the humid southern landscape like a city dedicated to order. Everything was right angles, manicured lawns, and the distant rhythmic chant of cadets on a morning run. It was a world built on precision and protocols, a world I understood on a theoretical level, but had never truly belonged to. I drove my unassuming sedan through the main entrance, the stark white buildings and perfectly aligned flags, a sharp contrast to the chaotic organic villages that lived in my recent memories. The ceremony was being held on the historic parade grounds, and the entrance was guarded by a pair of young military police officers in crisp dress uniforms. I pulled up to the security checkpoint, the afternoon sun glinting off the polished insignia on their caps. A young specialist, no older than 20, approached my window with a tablet in his hand. "Ma'am, invitation, please." He said, his voice polite but firm. I handed him the formal invitation my mother had mailed me, a heavy cardstock embossed with the Army crest. My name, Dr. Althea Grant, was printed in elegant script. He scanned the barcode, frowned, then tapped at the screen. He tried again, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, looking up, a hint of confusion in his eyes. "I don't have a Dr. Althea Grant on the guest list for Colonel Grant's promotion ceremony." I felt a familiar cold stillness settle over me. I had expected it, yet the reality of it was still a dull thud in my chest. This wasn't a mistake. It was a message. "Are you sure?" I asked, keeping my voice calm, betraying none of the weary frustration churning inside me. "My brother is Colonel Damon Grant. I'm his sister." "Yes, ma'am, I see that, but your name isn't on the approved list." He scrolled through the screen one more time, his discomfort growing. "I can't let you proceed without clearance. I'm very sorry." His apology was genuine. He was just a kid doing his job, caught in the crossfire of a family dynamic he couldn't possibly understand. Through the checkpoint, I could see the guests mingling on the lawn. I saw my father, his retired captain's uniform, immaculate, his posture ramrod straight as he chatted with a general. I saw my mother, a vision in pale blue, laughing with a group of officers' wives. They were in their element, a perfectly composed portrait of a proud military family. I knew with a certainty that was as sharp as it was painful, that my exclusion wasn't an administrative error. It was a deliberate omission. In my family's carefully constructed narrative, I was a peripheral character. My presence was tolerated, not celebrated. Forgetting to add me to the list was their way of reinforcing that. It was a quiet, bureaucratic shaming, a way to put me in my place before the event had even begun. The gate wasn't just a physical barrier. It was a judgment. And as I sat there, engine idling under the watchful eyes of a young soldier, I was officially and publicly an outsider. Just as the young specialist was about to deliver a final formal apology, a black government-issue SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the gate from the inside. It stopped, and the rear door opened. Out stepped my brother Colonel Damon Grant, the man of the hour. He was the epitome of a military poster boy. His uniform was so sharply pressed it looked like it could cut glass, the medals on his chest gleaming like a constellation of his own achievements. His posture was perfect, his jawline firm, and he carried himself with an easy, confident arrogance that had been his signature since childhood. He was followed by his wife Isabel, who looked like she'd stepped out of a catalog for luxury resort wear, her smile bright and practiced. Damon's eyes swept over the scene. He saw the specialist holding the tablet, my car idling at the checkpoint, and then me. For a fleeting second, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, maybe annoyance, maybe surprise. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cool, dismissive amusement. He didn't walk over. He didn't intervene. Instead, he leaned toward Isabel, his voice just loud enough to carry across the short distance, a casual stage whisper meant for me to hear. "Looks like Althea forgot to RSVP," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Some people just never learn how to follow protocol." The words were a casual cruelty, a public dismissal disguised as a light-hearted observation. Protocol. The irony was suffocating. I had navigated protocols in war zones that would make his parade ground rules look like a child's game. But in this world, his world, I was the one who was out of step. Isabel let out a small tinkling laugh, the kind that was more of a social signal than a genuine expression of humor. She adjusted the lapel on his uniform, a proprietary gesture that said, "This man is mine. This world is ours." My mother and father were only a few yards away. I saw my mother turn her pearls glowing against her skin. She saw me, her expression tightening for a moment before smoothing over into a mask of polite indifference. She turned her back, busying herself with a conversation. My father, ever the stoic captain, didn't even grant me a glance. He simply stood there, a rigid statue of paternal pride, as if his own daughter didn't exist just beyond the gate. This was the shaming I knew so well. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was a slow, quiet erosion of your existence. It was the deliberate act of looking through you, of treating you like a piece of furniture that was slightly out of place. The young specialist at the gate sensed it shifting on his feet, his professional composure faltering as he felt the cold wave of indifference emanating from my family. They walked away, then a perfect unit, leaving me in the dust of their polished ceremony. They didn't just leave me outside the gate, they left me outside the family. And as I watched them go, the casual cruelty of Damon's words echoed in my mind. He hadn't just forgotten to add my name to a list. He had actively erased me. The silence my family left behind was heavier than any argument. The young specialist looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and confusion. He was a good soldier caught between protocol and the unspoken brutal etiquette of family politics. He opened his mouth probably to offer another apology I didn't need. I saved him the trouble. I offered him a small, tight smile, the kind that isn't meant to convey warmth, but to signal the end of a conversation. "It's all right, son," I said, my voice steady. "Misunderstandings happen." I put the car in park and turned off the engine, a quiet act of defiance. I wasn't going to be sent away. I would wait. Just then, his radio crackled to life, a clipped official voice coming through the speaker. "Specialist, you have an update on the grant ceremony list. A priority addition from command level. Confirm receipt." The young man fumbled with the radio. Roger that command. Standing by." He glanced at his tablet, and his eyes widened. The screen refreshed, and a new name appeared at the top of the list, highlighted in green. Dr. Althea Grant. Clearance Level Alpha. Access all areas. He stared at the tablet, then back at me, his mouth slightly agape. "Ma'am," he stammered, his face flushing. "My deepest apologies. There was a clerical error. You're cleared. Please proceed." I knew it wasn't a clerical error. It was a signal from a different corner of the universe, a corner my family knew nothing about. Someone somewhere in the high command had seen my name on a travel manifest and pulled a string. It wasn't a favor. It was professional courtesy among ghosts. "Thank you, specialist," I said, starting the car again. I drove slowly through the gate, not with the triumphant feeling of victory, but with the quiet resolve of someone who is used to fighting invisible battles. I parked in a distant lot far from the gleaming SUVs of the senior officers. I walked toward the parade grounds, the sound of a brass band tuning up floating on the humid air. I didn't try to find my family. I knew where my assigned seat would be front and center with the other decorated family members, but I couldn't bring myself to sit there. It would feel like accepting a role in a play where I despised my character. Instead, I found a spot near the back, partially shaded by the long shadow of an old oak tree. From here, I could see everything. I saw Damon accepting congratulations, his arm draped possessively around Isabel. I saw my father talking with the two-star general, their laughter booming across the lawn. I saw my mother adjusting the seating cards, a perfect hostess in a world that valued presentation above all else. I was a ghost at my own family's celebration, an uninvited guest who had slipped through the cracks. Standing there hidden in plain sight, I felt a strange sense of calm. They had tried to erase me, but they had failed. They thought they controlled the narrative, but they didn't know the whole story. And as the master of ceremonies stepped up to the podium to begin, I simply watched and waited, a silent observer holding a truth that could shatter their perfect daylight glass. The ceremony began with the predictable pomp and circumstance. A military band played an honor guard marched with perfect precision, and a chaplain gave a generic invocation. I remained in my spot under the oak tree, an island of stillness in a sea of formal movement. The crowd was a blur of dress uniforms and brightly colored dresses. I felt completely detached, an anthropologist observing a strange foreign ritual, even though it was in honor of my own family. Then I saw him. He was standing near a group of junior officers, but he wasn't one of them. He was a sergeant major, and you could tell just by looking at him that he had seen more real combat than half the colonels in attendance. His face was a roadmap of deserts and mountains. His posture relaxed, but coiled like a predator at rest. His uniform, while correct, seemed out of place on him, as if it were a costume he was temporarily enduring. He wasn't made for parade grounds. He was made for the field. His eyes scanned the crowd with a practiced sweeping gaze that missed nothing. They passed over the generals in the front row, the politicians, my family, and then they landed on me. For a moment his gaze locked with mine. There was no confusion in his eyes, only recognition. A slow, subtle shift occurred in his expression. He straightened slightly, not out of military formality, but out of respect. He broke away from the group he was with and began walking toward me. His path was direct, cutting a straight line through the mingling guests. A few officers turned to watch, their brows furrowed. A sergeant major of his seniority didn't just wander over to chat with a civilian woman hiding in the back. It was a breach of the unspoken social protocol. He stopped a few feet in front of me, ignoring the curious glances. "Dr. Grant." He set his voice a low, gravelly rumble that could command legions. His nod was brief, but it was laden with a weight of shared experience that no one else there could possibly understand. He didn't salute with a snap of his hand to his brow. He gave me something far more meaningful. A slight dip of his chin, a look of profound, battle-forged respect. "It's an honor to see you stateside, ma'am," he added quietly. I simply nodded back, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. "Sergeant Major Thompson." He was the senior enlisted man for a unit I'd worked with 2 years ago, a man who had seen firsthand how my academic work had saved 3 of his young soldiers from walking into a trap. His respect wasn't given lightly, and it was worth more than all the polite applause on this field combined. The few people close enough to hear turned to look at me again, their expressions morphing from dismissal to confusion. The invisible woman in the corner had just been acknowledged by a living legend. The first crack had appeared in my family's perfect facade. A small, almost imperceptible ripple had just disturbed the calm surface of their perfect day. Sergeant Major Thompson gave me one last knowing nod before melting back into the crowd, leaving me in the center of a small bubble of newfound curiosity. A few people who had witnessed the exchange kept glancing in my direction. their expressions a mixture of confusion and speculation. I ignored them, my attention fixed on the ceremony, my posture unchanged. I had learned long ago that in a world of whispers, the most powerful response was a dignified silence. A few minutes later, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a straightening of spines here, a quieting of conversation there. It was the kind of instinctive reaction that ripples through a military gathering when true power enters the space. I looked toward the main path and saw him, General Marcus Sullivan. He was a four-star general, a man whose name was spoken with a kind of reverence usually reserved for historical figures. He was a legend, a strategist who had reshaped modern warfare, a leader whose command was sought by presidents. His presence was less of an arrival and more of a gravitational event, pulling the attention of the entire field toward him. Even my father, a man not easily impressed, straightened his shoulders a little taller. General Sullivan moved with an unhurried grace, flanked by two aides who struggled to keep up. He greeted a senator with a brief handshake and nodded to a handful of other senior officers, each acknowledgement a carefully measured gift. His eyes, the color of faded steel, swept across the front rows, taking in the entire assembly with a calm, assessing gaze. This was his world, and everyone here was a player on his board. I expected his gaze to pass over the back of the crowd to dismiss the periphery as unimportant. It was the natural order of things, but it didn't. His eyes continued their slow, deliberate scan until they found me standing alone in the shade of the oak tree. The crowd between us seemed to melt away. He stopped walking for a fraction of a second. His aides paused behind him, confused. General Sullivan's gaze held mine from across the manicured lawn. There was no surprise in his expression, only a quiet, resolute acknowledgement. And then, in full view of everyone, he raised his chin and gave me a slow, formal, and utterly unmistakable nod of respect. It wasn't the nod you give a stranger or a subordinate's family member. It was the nod one professional gives another. A greeting between equals on a battlefield no one else could see. The effect was instantaneous. The whispers that had started with Sergeant Major Thompson now grew into a low, buzzing murmur. Heads turned not just with curiosity, but with genuine bewilderment. Who was this woman in a simple civilian dress standing in the back, who had just received a formal acknowledgement from a four-star general? From across the field, I saw my brother Damon's confident smile falter for a split second. I saw my father's head whip in my direction, his brow furrowed in a deep, complicated knot of confusion and disbelief. He more than anyone understood the immense weight of that single gesture. A man like General Sullivan did nothing by accident. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I simply met the general's gaze and returned his nod with one of my own. The chessboard had been set, and a piece my family had long considered irrelevant had just been revealed as a major player. The air grew thick with unspoken questions, and the real ceremony had yet to begin. The air on the parade ground was now thick with unspoken tension. The polite murmurs had been replaced by a watchful silence. The ceremony, which was supposed to be a straightforward celebration of my brother's achievement, had been subtly hijacked by a mystery no one could solve. The mystery of me. General Sullivan took a seat in the front row, his presence a quiet anchor in the churning sea of speculation. From my vantage point, I could see the effect his acknowledgement had on my family. My father kept shooting furtive glances in my direction, his brow knitted in a permanent state of confused disapproval. My mother was whispering frantically to Isabel, who now looked at me not with dismissal, but with a new sharp-edged curiosity. And Damon, my brother, the star of the show. He stood straighter, his smile a little tighter, a little more forced. He was a man who thrived on control and predictability, and his carefully orchestrated day had just been thrown a curveball he couldn't have anticipated. The master of ceremonies, a portly major with a booming voice, finally seemed to regain his composure and move the proceedings along. He read from a prepared script, listing Damon's accomplishments, his commendations, his exemplary service record. The words were impressive, the accolades well-earned, but they now felt hollow, like a story with a missing chapter. Finally, the moment arrived. Colonel Damon Grant, Please step forward." The crowd erupted in polite, dutiful applause. My parents beamed with pride, their temporary confusion forgotten in the glory of the moment. Damon walked to the center of the stage, his every move a study in military precision. A senior officer, a vice admiral, stepped forward and pinned the new Silver Eagle insignia of a full colonel onto his uniform. Damon shook the vice admiral's hand, saluted crisply, and then turned to face the crowd. He approached the podium, his expression a mask of practiced humility and pride. The applause died down and a hush fell over the audience. It was time for his speech. I watched him, my heart a slow, steady drum in my chest. This was his moment, his chance to be gracious, to be the bigger man. He could have acknowledged me even with a simple nod. He could have chosen connection over condescension. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He thanked his commanders, his mentors, his wife, and his parents. He spoke of duty, honor, and the legacy of service in the Grant family. His voice was strong, confident, exactly what you'd expect from a rising star in the Army. He had the crowd in the palm of his hand. They were captivated by the image of the perfect soldier, the perfect son. And as he stood there, bathed in the warm Georgia sun and the adoration of his peers, I knew with a chilling certainty that he wasn't going to choose grace. He was going to choose pride. The stage was set not just for his promotion, but for a betrayal that would be far more public and far more devastating than simply leaving a name off a list. He had the spotlight, and he was about to aim it like a weapon. Damon paused in his speech, letting his eyes roam over the audience. He took a sip of water, a practiced move to build anticipation. He was about to move from thanking his superiors to telling a story, the part of the speech meant to humanize him, to make him seem like more than just a uniform. "I want to share something with you all," he began, his voice taking on a more serious, intimate tone. A moment from the field that defines what leadership is all about. He told them about his time in the Korengal Valley, a story I knew better than he did. He spoke of being surrounded, of communications being down, of his men facing certain annihilation. The crowd leaned in, captivated. And then the lie came. It was delivered so smoothly, so confidently, that anyone who didn't know the truth would have believed it without question. In that moment of chaos, he said, his voice ringing with false modesty, "We received a piece of intelligence." It was a jumbled mess, really. A crudely drawn map from some local source, something so flimsy I almost threw it away. He let out a small, self-deprecating chuckle, but something, a gut feeling, an instinct that a commander has to trust, told me to follow it. It went against all standard procedure, against everything the books teach you. But I trusted my intuition, and that intuition, that gut feeling, led every single one of my men out of that valley to safety. The applause was thunderous. He had painted himself as the maverick hero, the leader whose instincts transcended protocol. He let the applause wash over him, a triumphant smile on his face. And then he did the unforgivable. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes finding me in the back, and he twisted the knife. He smirked, a cruel, condescending glint in his eye. "It's funny," he continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It reminds me of my sister, Althea. She's a brilliant academic, a doctor in her field. She spends her life drawing these incredibly detailed family trees of ancient tribes, all these intricate little maps of who's related to whom." He gestured vaguely with his hand. "It's fascinating stuff, I'm sure, but completely and utterly useless on a real battlefield." A wave of polite, confused laughter rippled through the parts of the crowd that didn't know better. My family smiled proudly. He had managed to praise himself while simultaneously dismissing my life's work in a single, elegantly cruel stroke. The humiliation was a physical thing. It was a hot, suffocating wave that washed over me. He hadn't just lied. He hadn't just stolen my victory. He had taken the very act that saved his life, the product of my knowledge and my sacrifice, and he had publicly branded it as worthless. He had used his moment of glory to ensure I had none. I stood there frozen under the shade of the oak tree. My face was a mask of calm, but inside, a quiet, cold fury began to burn. The injustice of it all was absolute. He had drawn his line in the sand. He had made his choice. And in doing so, he had unknowingly set the stage for a reckoning he could never have imagined. He thought he was delivering the final word. He had no idea he had just given the opening statement for the prosecution. Damon basked in the fading applause, his face a portrait of smug satisfaction. He gave a final magnanimous nod to the audience and turned to leave the podium, his performance complete. He expected to walk off that stage a hero, his version of history now cemented as fact. He never made it. "Hold on a moment, Colonel." The voice cut through the air calm, but carrying an authority that was absolute. It wasn't loud, but it stopped everything. Every head turned. The band which had been preparing to play went silent. Damon froze mid-step, his back to the crowd, his body going rigid. General Marcus Sullivan rose from his seat in the front row. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, climbing the few steps to the stage. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't look at the other dignitaries. His gaze was fixed like a laser on my brother. The master of ceremonies, the portly major, started to step forward, a confused and flustered expression on his face. But a single, almost imperceptible glance from General Sullivan stopped him dead in his tracks. The stage now belonged to the general. "Stay where you are, Colonel Grant." General Sullivan said, his voice quiet but echoing across the silent parade ground. The general walked to the podium, standing not behind it but beside it, as if to make it clear this was no longer part of the scheduled program. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension. The audience was utterly still, sensing that the polished veneer of the ceremony was about to be shattered. I saw my father lean forward in his seat, his face a mask of disbelief and dawning apprehension. He knew better than anyone what it meant when a four-star general interrupted a promotion ceremony. It wasn't a social call. It was an intervention. It was a course correction of the highest order. Damon slowly turned around to face the general, his practiced smile now gone, replaced by a tight, nervous confusion. "Yes, General," he managed to say, his voice a fraction higher than usual. General Sullivan didn't answer him immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch out, letting the weight of the moment press down on my brother. He let Damon stand there, exposed and alone in the center of the stage, the celebrated hero of a few moments ago, now looking like a student called to the principal's office. From the back of the crowd, I watched my heart beating a slow, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The ground had begun to shift beneath my family's feet. The quiet, invisible war I had been fighting for years was about to go public. The general hadn't just interrupted a speech, he had interrupted a lie, and I knew with a certainty that resonated deep in my bones that nothing would ever be the same again. The reckoning had arrived. General Sullivan stared at my brother, his steel-colored eyes unblinking. The entire audience held its breath. "That was a compelling story, Colonel," the general said, his voice deceptively mild. "A fine example of leadership under pressure." He paused, letting his words hang in the air for a moment before delivering the first blow. "But you got the most important part of it wrong." Damon's face paled slightly. "I'm sorry, General. I don't understand." "It wasn't your intuition that saved your men." General Sullivan continued, his voice hardening, losing its mild edge and taking on the sharp crack of command. "It wasn't a gut feeling. It was intelligence. Hard-won, high-risk human intelligence." The general's eyes swept over the front row, over the senators and the other senior officers, before landing back on Damon. He was no longer just speaking to my brother. He was speaking to the record. He was correcting a falsehood in front of witnesses who mattered. That crude map, the one you almost threw away, wasn't from some random local source. He stated each word a precise, calculated strike. It was a highly detailed schematic of enemy positions, safe routes, and tribal allegiances delivered to your unit through a classified channel by one of the most valuable intelligence assets we had in the entire theater of operations. My father's hand, which had been resting on my mother's arm, tightened. My mother brought her other hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. They were beginning to understand. The story they had cherished, the one that proved their son's brilliance, was beginning to unravel thread by thread. You see, Colonel General Sullivan went on, his voice relentless, leaving Damon no room to speak, no space to recover. Leadership isn't just about having good instincts. It's about having the wisdom to recognize and trust good intelligence, especially when it comes from an unconventional source. It's about respecting the sacrifices others make in the shadows so that you can succeed in the sun. Damon stood there utterly exposed. The heroic narrative he had so carefully crafted for himself had just been systematically dismantled by the one man in the room whose word was irrefutable. He was no longer the maverick hero. He was a commander who had been saved by an intelligence report. He was too arrogant to understand and too dishonest to acknowledge. The general had taken Damon's lie and held it up to the light for everyone to see its cheap, hollow construction. The public humiliation was just beginning. Damon stood frozen on the stage, his face a ghostly white, under the bright sun. The silence on the parade ground was absolute, a heavy blanket of shock and disbelief. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground crumble away at his feet. He opened his mouth, trying to form a word, a defense, anything, but nothing came out. He was speechless, stripped of his heroic narrative, and left with nothing but the raw, ugly truth of his deception. General Sullivan let the weight of his words settle for another long moment. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping past the stunned dignitaries in the front row, past the sea of uniforms, until his eyes found me still standing in the quiet shade of the oak tree at the back of the crowd. Our eyes met across the distance. In his, I saw not pity, but a profound, unwavering respect. He was giving me a silent signal, letting me know that the years of my invisible work were about to be made visible. The general turned his attention back to the silent, gaping audience. His voice, when he spoke again, was clear and resonant, each word carrying the weight of historical record. That intelligence asset, he announced, the expert who spent 6 months living among insurgents facing unimaginable risks to gain their trust and map their networks, has a name. He paused, a master of dramatic timing, letting the entire assembly hang on his next words. I saw my father grip the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. I saw Isabel Damon's wife stare at her husband with a dawning look of horror and betrayal. The general looked directly at my brother, who seemed to shrink under the intensity of his gaze. That asset, Colonel, the person who saved your life and the lives of every man in your battalion, is Dr. Althea Grant, your sister. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. It was the sound of 1,000 minds simultaneously rearranging reality. Every single head on that field swiveled in my direction. In an instant, I went from being the invisible woman in the corner to the absolute center of everyone's attention. The weight of their stares was a physical force, but I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my expression unreadable, letting the truth, my truth, finally occupy the space it deserved. On the stage, Damon staggered back a step as if he had been physically struck. His eyes found mine wide with a desperate, panicked disbelief. The brother who had mocked my life's work, who had dismissed my contributions as useless, was now forced to confront the staggering, undeniable fact that his greatest battlefield triumph was not his own. It was a gift from the very sister he had so publicly and cruelly disdained. The humiliation was absolute. The justice was poetic. The world seemed to hang suspended in that moment of stunning revelation. The air was thick with the silent fallout of the truth. Damon stood on the stage, a broken statue, his arrogance shattered into a million pieces. The eyes of everyone were locked on me, the ghost who had just been given a name and a history more powerful than anyone could have imagined. But General Sullivan wasn't finished. There was one final piece of the story to tell, one final irrefutable piece of evidence to present. He turned his gaze back to me, his voice softening slightly but still carrying across the silent field. "Dr. Grant," he said, addressing me directly, "I believe there was a cost to acquiring that intelligence, a testament to the risks you took, if you wouldn't mind." His words were a request, but they felt like a key unlocking the final door. He wasn't asking me to speak. He knew I wouldn't. He was asking me to show them. I didn't break eye contact with my brother. His face was a canvas of shock and dawning shame. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down and took the edge of my left sleeve, the simple fabric of my civilian blouse. With a calm, steady motion, I pushed the sleeve up my forearm. The gasp from the crowd was sharper this time, more visceral. It wasn't a sound of surprise. It was a sound of horror and awe. There on my skin was the proof. A long, jagged scar, a pale, puckered line of damaged tissue that ran from my wrist almost to my elbow. It was an ugly thing, a permanent reminder of a close encounter with an enemy's blade, a wound I had suffered during an interrogation, after being captured an ordeal I had survived and never spoken of. It was the physical price of the map that had saved my brother's life. General Sullivan delivered the final devastating blow, his voice a quiet verdict that sealed Damon's fate. "Colonel Grant," he said, his eyes never leaving my brother's shattered expression. "The map that led you to safety was drawn with charcoal and goatskin, but the intelligence behind it was paid for with the blood and sacrifice of your own sister. That scar is the receipt. The truth landed with the force of a physical impact. It wasn't just that I had saved him. It was that I had bled for him. While he was collecting medals, I was collecting scars. While he was building a career on a lie, I was living with the physical consequences of the truth." He finally broke. Damon's shoulders slumped, his head fell, and he stood there in the center of his own ceremony, utterly and completely defeated. He had been undone, not by an enemy, but by a truth he had tried to bury, and a scar he never knew existed. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the silence of anticipation anymore. It was the heavy, echoing silence of a detonation. The truth had landed, and now everyone was standing in the wreckage of Damon's carefully constructed world. On stage, my brother didn't move. He just stood there, head bowed, a man publicly stripped of his honor. The silver eagles on his collar, which had gleamed with so much pride just minutes before, now seemed to mock him, emblems of a rank he had received on the foundation of a lie. The master of ceremonies, looking pale and shaken, finally found the courage to step forward and quietly dismiss him, ending the most excruciating promotion ceremony in the history of Fort Benning. As Damon stumbled off the stage, avoiding everyone's eyes, the collective gaze of the crowd shifted. It was no longer just on me. It was on my family. My father sat frozen in his front row seat, his face ashen. The stern, judgmental mask he always wore had crumbled, replaced by a look of profound, horrified shock. He was a man who lived by a code of honor, and he had just witnessed his own son's complete and utter dishonor. He stared at my arm, at the scar that was still visible, as if it were a foreign language he was desperately trying to comprehend. My mother was crying, not loudly, but with silent, shuddering sobs, her hand pressed to her mouth as if to hold back a wail of shame and regret. Her carefully maintained composure was gone, washed away by a truth she could no longer ignore. Isabel Damon's wife simply stared into the middle distance, her perfect poised expression now slack with disbelief and humiliation. The family unit, which had presented such a flawless image of pride and unity, had imploded in public view. Then the murmurs started. They were different now. Not whispers of confusion, but of awe and respect. I heard fragments as the crowd began to stir. "My God, she's the one. Lived with them for 6 months." He never knew. I slowly pulled my sleeve back down, covering the scar. Its purpose had been served. It had spoken a truth louder than any words. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt a quiet, hollow sense of finality. The war was over. People began to move around me, giving me a wide berth as if I were something fragile or dangerous. Their looks were no longer dismissive. They were filled with a mixture of reverence, pity, and a deep, unsettling respect. In the space of 5 minutes, I had transformed from the family outcast into a legend. General Sullivan made his way through the parting crowd and stopped before me. He didn't say a word about what had just happened. He simply said, "Dr. Grant, the reception is starting. I believe there are a number of people who are very eager to speak with you." He was offering me an exit, a way to transition from the raw emotion of the field to the structured formality of the officers' club. He was giving me back a sense of control. I nodded, my voice still feeling distant. "Thank you, General." And with that, I turned away from the wreckage of my family's pride and walked toward the next chapter, leaving them to sit alone in the deafening silence of their own making. The officers' club was a whirlwind of polished wood-hushed conversations and the clinking of glasses. The atmosphere, however, was anything but celebratory. The dramatic events on the parade ground had followed everyone inside, hanging in the air like a storm cloud. As I walked in with General Sullivan, a respectful pace behind me, a strange thing happened. Conversations stopped. Back straightened, the sea of uniforms seemed to part before me. I was no longer an invisible entity. I was the center of gravity in the room. Officers who wouldn't have given me a second glance an hour ago now watched me with expressions of profound awe. I didn't seek out the attention. I found a quiet corner, accepted a glass of water from a server, and simply stood observing. I had no desire for revenge or gloating. The truth had been revealed, and that was enough. My victory wasn't in their applause, it was in the quiet finality of what had happened. This was the fam jia, the dignity of a winner, to show restraint when you held all the power. But I knew the confrontation was inevitable. He approached me alone. Damon. His uniform looked rumpled, now his posture defeated. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out shame. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He stopped a few feet away, as if afraid to get any closer. "Althea," he began, his voice barely a whisper. It was cracked and hoarse. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the words. "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." I looked at him, my expression unreadable. I didn't offer him comfort. I didn't offer him anger. I just offered him silence, forcing him to stand in the uncomfortable space he had created. The scar, he choked out, his eyes darting to my arm. "What they did to you, Althea, I am so sorry." His apology felt real. It was born not of social pressure, but of a sudden brutal understanding of his own ignorance and cruelty. He was finally seeing me not as the sister who was a convenient punchline, but as a person who had suffered in ways he couldn't comprehend and had done so for his sake. I listened to his rambling, broken words. He was sorry for the lie, sorry for the speech, sorry for years of dismissal. Finally, when he ran out of words, I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement not of forgiveness, but of acceptance. I accepted his apology not for his benefit, but for mine. It was the final step in closing a chapter of my life that had been defined by his opinion of me. By accepting his apology, I was releasing myself from the need to ever hear one again. I was severing the final tie that gave his judgment any power over me. I was at last free. My conversation with Damon was a quiet private storm in the midst of the larger event. After he retreated shamefaced into the crowd, I felt a sense of finality. The personal battle was over, but the public one was just beginning to resolve itself. General Sullivan, who had observed our interaction from a respectful distance, made his way back to my side. He held 2 glasses, handing one to me. It was just water, but it felt like a gesture of solidarity. "A difficult moment," he said, his voice low. "A necessary one." I replied, my own voice surprisingly steady. He nodded, his eyes scanning the room. The whispers had not died down. If anything, they had intensified. The revelation on the parade ground had created a vacuum of information, and the room was buzzing with speculation. Who was this woman really? What had she done? The general seemed to read the room's collective mind. He subtly guided me toward the center of the grand hall, where a small informal stage was set up with a podium. He tapped the microphone lightly, and the gentle feedback instantly silenced the room. All eyes turned to him, and by extension to me. "Thank you all for attending today's ceremony." He began, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "We are here to celebrate promotion, to recognize leadership, and to honor service. But sometimes service takes forms we don't always see on a parade ground." He paused, letting his gaze drift over the faces in the crowd. "For years, the U.S. Army has benefited from a program so successful and so sensitive that its very existence has been a closely guarded secret. This program, the Human Terrain System, embeds our nation's brightest social scientists with combat units in the most dangerous places on Earth. These experts don't carry rifles. They carry knowledge. They map the human landscape, building trust and understanding where others only see hostility. They have saved countless American lives by preventing conflicts before they begin. He turned and looked directly at me. His next words were not for me, but for everyone else. The architect of that program, its most effective and courageous field agent, and its future leader is standing right here. It has become clear to the Pentagon that the strategic value of this work can no longer be relegated to the shadows. We need to create a new command structure, one that integrates this vital human intelligence at the highest levels of strategic planning. He let the implications of that sink in. Then, with a voice full of pride and historical weight, he delivered the final confirmation. Therefore, it is my distinct honor to be the first to publicly announce the formation of the new Strategic Cultural Intelligence Command, and to introduce you to its first commanding officer. At last, Admiral Grant. The title hung in the air, stunning and absolute. Admiral, a rank of command, of authority, of power. The room exploded in applause, a genuine thunderous ovation that was nothing like the polite clapping for Damon. This was for me, for the ghost who had just been given a fleet. I left the reception not long after the general's announcement. I had shaken more hands and accepted more congratulations than I could count. But the noise and the attention felt distant, like a radio playing in another room. The real victory wasn't the applause or the new title. It was the quiet settling of a lifetime of turmoil. I didn't want to go back to a sterile hotel room. Instead, on an impulse I didn't fully understand, I found myself driving toward my parents' house, the one I had grown up in. I parked on the quiet tree-lined street and just sat for a moment looking at the familiar brick facade. I didn't go to the front door. I walked around the side through the creaking gate and into the backyard. It was just as I remembered it. A sprawling lawn, my mother's meticulously tended rose bushes, and in the center, a massive old oak tree. My father had planted it the year I was born. For years, I had felt as insignificant as a single leaf on its mighty branches. I walked over and rested my hand on its rough bark. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard, and the evening air was cool and calm. I heard the back door slide open, but I didn't turn. I knew who it was. My father walked across the lawn, his steps slower, less certain than I'd ever known them to be. He stopped beside me, not looking at me, but at the tree. We stood there in silence for a long time, a father and a daughter who were essentially strangers. I saw the scar, he said, finally, his voice raspy with an emotion I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper, something broken. I didn't reply. I just kept my hand on the tree. For 30 years, he continued, his voice heavy with the weight of a lifetime of conviction. I measured a soldier's worth by the decorations on their chest. The medals, the ribbons, the rank. That's how my father measured me. It's the only way I knew. He finally turned to look at me, and in the fading light, I could see the glistening in his eyes. His stoic captain's mask was gone, and in its place was just a man old and full of regret. Today I realized I was wrong, he said, his voice thick. I spent my whole life counting the medals when I should have been looking for the scars. The scars are what tell the real story. They're what prove you were there, what prove you paid a price. He reached out his hand, hesitating for a moment before he gently touched my arm, his fingers tracing the air just above the sleeve that covered my wound. Your brother has a chest full of ribbons, Althea, he said, his voice finally breaking. But you have a soldier's scar. You are the truest soldier of us all. I am so sorry I never saw it. It wasn't an absolution I had ever sought, but hearing it felt like the final heavy stone being lifted from my shoulders. The approval I had subconsciously craved and been denied my entire life was finally given, not because of a title or a promotion, but because he finally understood the meaning of sacrifice. He finally saw me. The weeks that followed my father's quiet apology were a blur of motion and purpose. I moved to Washington, D.C., leaving my quiet university life behind for the humming strategic heart of the nation. My new office was in a secure wing of the Pentagon, a place of hushed tones and immense gravity. The plaque on the door was simple, elegant, and bore a title that still felt new on my tongue. Admiral Althea Grant, Commanding Officer, Strategic Cultural Intelligence Command. It wasn't a corner office with a sprawling view. It was a functional, secure space, a command center. The largest wall wasn't made of glass, but of a massive interactive digital map of the world covered in layers of data that only my team and I could fully comprehend. It showed troop movements and supply lines, but it also showed migration patterns, religious festivals, tribal boundaries, and the intricate, invisible threads of human connection that truly define a battlefield. My team was a collection of the brightest minds I'd ever known: anthropologists, sociologists, historians, linguists, all of them patriots who had been serving in the shadows, their contributions often overlooked. Now, for the first time, they were not just advisors. They were commanders in their own right. They had a seat at the table. We were no longer just providing footnotes for military reports. We were writing the opening chapters. I thought of Damon often not with anger, but with a distant clinical empathy. He had been stripped of his command and reassigned to a desk job, a quiet and humiliating end to a once promising career. He had to live with the public knowledge of his lie that I knew was a punishment far greater than any official reprimand. Our family never spoke of it again. The silence itself was a form of scar tissue, a sign that a wound had been so deep it could never fully heal, only be covered over. One afternoon, General Sullivan visited my new command center. He walked around observing my team as they worked, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. "You didn't just get a promotion, Althea," he said quietly, standing beside me as we watched the global map pulse with information. "You started a revolution. You've changed the very definition of what intelligence means to the United States Army." I looked at the young faces of my team, the men and women who were now empowered to use their unique skills to save lives. I thought of the soldiers on the ground who would now be better equipped, better understood, and safer because of the work we were doing. My gaze drifted to my left arm. The scar was always there, a permanent part of me. For years, I had seen it as a reminder of pain and survival. But now I saw it differently. It was a reminder that the deepest wounds can become the source of your greatest strength. It was the mark of a past I had survived, but it was also the foundation of the future I was now building. I wasn't the forgotten sister anymore. I wasn't the invisible academic. I was Admiral Grant, and our work was just beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Althea's story is a powerful reminder that your value is never determined by someone else's inability to see your worth. True strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet resilience, the knowledge you carry, and the scars you've earned that define who you are. Let them underestimate you. Let them overlook you. And then let them watch you change the world. What did you think of that ending? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story and want more tales of justice and vindication, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next.